Every person has to lead. So how do you lead based on who you are? In today's podcast, we talk with Tim Schneider, CEO of Investors Community Bank, who shares his story on how his natural leadership style was shaped growing up on a dairy farm that led to taking the bank public. Welcome back to the Stop the Vanilla podcast. I'm Steve Van Remortel. This podcast will give you the knowledge, the templates, and the practical steps to achieve what you want in your business, your career, and your life by having the right plan implemented by the right talent. Welcome to the Stop the Vanilla podcast. You know, one of the greatest sources of learning is learning from other leaders that are having success. And on our podcast, we like to have leaders share their story and share some of their principles of success. And on today's podcast, we welcome Tim Schneider into our virtual Stop the Vanilla studios. Pretty nice studios we got here today, huh, Tim?
Absolutely.
This whole virtual thing during the COVID. Tim's the CEO of Investors Community Bank. And first of all, I want to welcome Tim. I really appreciate you taking some of your valuable time to be here and share your story and what you've learned along the way so that other leaders can learn from our conversation today. So let's set the stage quickly here on what we're going to talk about. So I'm really fired up about our conversation today because this is a topic that every leader has to, answer for themselves, and every leader will benefit from. And it's really about how do we lead based on who we are naturally, how we're wired. How do we lead our team based on who we are? What are the strengths and blind spots of our style? And so everybody has to lead, but how do you as a leader most effectively lead? And that's what we're really going to talk about today in our podcast. So let's dive into our podcast. So first of all, Tim, one of the things we like to do on our podcast is really learn your story and learn a little bit about you and the bank. And so tell us your story and your journey and things you've learned along the way so that our listeners can understand how you became the leader that you are today.
Sure. Thanks again, Steve, for having me. I grew up on a dairy farm in a little town called Hilbert, not far from here, which taught me a great work ethic, if nothing else, for sure. But I decided early on that staying on the farm wasn't my future path. And, at the time, the labor was difficult to find. So we worked, constantly, 365 days a year. I think the longest vacation we'd get was a long weekend, someplace Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and probably going to Green Bay to the Midway Motor Lodge was one of my...
big time. That's big time.
We hit the pool, it was, the kids were having fun, but it's changed a lot in the dairy industry these days. There's a lot less labor involved, and they can live a life and have a lifestyle like anybody else. So I decided to go off to college, and I was the first in our family to graduate from college. My mom definitely encouraged that. My dad, I think, was like, well, I don't know if that's the right path for you, but he was supportive. Anyway, went off to school 5 hours away, which was a big move for me because growing up on a farm, you didn't ever leave your family. And it was an adjustment to be away from mom in particular and her good cooking that she had 3 squares a day for us all the time on the farm.
Yeah.
Went there with the intent of pursuing an accounting degree and started down that path and decided maybe accounting wasn't the exact path, but I wanted to stay in business in some form or fashion. So I ended up with a management degree with a econ minor, and ended up getting an internship at the Farm Credit Services System, which is an agricultural lending cooperative that's nationwide, through a connection I had as my uncle was actually on their board of directors. And that turned into a permanent position once I graduated from college, and really have enjoyed the finance banking path that I've taken, and I love it. I've always liked numbers, but it's the numbers as well as the consultative piece and dealing with your clients and the relationships that you create, which probably steered me away from accounting early on because it felt like that was sit behind your desk and count beans and, fill out financial statements and those kinds of things. So anyway, that's my path to kind of where we're at today. I've been in banking for about 30 years now, worked for a number of different institutions. Myself and my 3 founding partners of Investors Community Bank worked at a bank here, a large bank in Manitowoc, And we talked for a while about, breaking away and doing our own thing. We spent 2 or 3 years planning for this, meeting in the evenings, privately trying to put our business plan together, and finally decided it was time to break. And, we've been around for 23 years now. We built this organization to about $1.4 billion in assets. Took the company public back in 2005. And, it's been enormously successful and very gratifying to see what the organization's become and the number of people that we've helped support from a customer perspective, and as well team members that we have here. They're now about 175 strong. So it's been an exciting journey, and I wouldn't trade it in for anything.
So you went from being a dairy farmer to a CEO of a bank that you founded. I mean, that's an awesome story. So we're going to dive into that a little bit as we go through this, as we go through our conversation today. And so what we're going to talk about today on our podcast with Tim and his journey and learning from how he developed into the leader that he was is that we call it your leadership identity. Every one of us has a natural behavioral style. And one of the reasons I was excited about our podcast today is Tim's style is quite different from mine. So we're going to compare and contrast our styles. And again, not one style is better than another, but really the key and the takeaway from today is understanding what your style is. And many people call it your disc graph. We call it your natural behavioral style, but it's who you are. It's how you're wired. And Tim's wired, we have some similarities, but we have some pretty significant differences. And so Tim and I lead differently. And the takeaway for you today in our podcast is, how do you need to lead with your natural style? Because one of the things that we see a lot of people do, and Tim probably seen this along the way, is that people think, wow, that's a really great leader. I loved working for that leader, and I want to lead like they do. And we kind of call that style envy. It's, you don't want to lead like somebody else because you're likely wired very different from them. So we use the DISC behavioral science here, and the D, I, S, and the C stand for something. The D is for dominance. It's how you deal with problems and conflict. The I is for influencing. It's how you deal with people. The S is how you deal with your pace, and the C is how you deal with details and compliance. And so Tim and I have two very different styles. So I'm going to give you the DISC for Tim, and then I'm going to give you my DISC, and you'll see how we have very different styles, but we lead differently, but have a lot of success that we both have enjoyed. So Tim's DISC, his D is a 17, his I is a 78, his S is a 90, and his C is a 32. Okay, so 17, 78, 90, and 32. And my D is an 88. So my D is an 88, Tim's is a 17. We have a very different style there. Our I's are about the same. My S is a 7 and Tim's is a 90. So we have very different style there. And then our compliance is about the same as well. So our D and our S's are very different. And so it's really important for you to understand your DISC style, because that's how you define your leadership identity. And if you need any information on DISC, you can email us at info@stopthevanilla.com. But so Tim, as we talk about our leadership identity, I first want to talk to you about how did you come into developing your leadership identity? I mean, you and I, obviously, we've known each other a long time, and we've had this discussion about leading with your style. Did it kind of come naturally, or was there a lot of learnings along the way, maybe a little pain along the way in learning how to lead with your style? So let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think first, it probably did come naturally. And I think one of the things as a leader you need to realize, and you've said it to me multiple times, be genuine, be yourself, right? And don't try to be something you're not. And I think I figured that out along the way, working for a bunch of different bosses that had different styles. You pick up different pieces that you like, some you throw away that you don't like, and it kind of creates your own leadership style that directs you into the future. So I think it really did come very naturally. I think a lot of it stems back to, growing up, my parents and how they treated me. My dad was a brutally hard worker, busted his butt all day long on the farm, multiple hours, never rested, taught me a great work ethic, which I still have today. My mom was a very caring individual. Both parents were very selfless. They're worried about everybody else and not about themselves first. That's a key trait in my leadership style, and I think that's what's gotten me and our team to the success level we've had because of some of that, that maybe servant leadership style that we practice here that you're familiar with, Steve.
Yeah. So you have a 90S on your behavioral style, and so an S is your pace of work, and so some of the strengths that come from the S. I'm going to talk about this, but I want you to talk about it in your style. Like I have a very fast pace. I have a 7 on my S, and so the strengths of the leadership strengths that come with a higher S style, listening comes more naturally. Being more empathetic and better at, actually somebody with a higher S is going to probably be better at coaching because they're going to take some time. They're going to be patient, right? They're going to listen. So talk a little bit about some of the strengths that come from your higher S, because one of the things that we see a lot, Tim, is that when we benchmark a leadership position, a lot of times we'll see a lower S. And I really want to communicate to our listeners that any style can lead, and Tim's success has proven that. And he's leveraged his strengths and really overcome the blind spots of his style, which every leader has to do. So we're going to talk about the strengths of your style, Tim. We're going to talk about the blind spots of your style. Let's talk about the strengths of your style that bring incredible value to you as a leader. What do you see as maybe your top strengths of your leadership style?
Yeah, I think a couple big words that come to mind are steady. Don't get shaken very often. I'm a very optimistic person. I remain optimistic even in trying times and challenging times. I rarely, if ever, raise my voice in meetings when I'm talking to people. I think that comes across as threatening. If I do, people know that things are pretty serious, but it doesn't happen very often. I think all those factors, I put in a lot of time. I'm hardworking. I'm consistent. I think that consistency people recognize and appreciate. I think people trust me because of all those factors. So those are a few of the, I guess, key words that I'd say kind of describe that S.
Yeah, and one of the things that you and I have talked about before that is an important tenet of your leadership style that comes from that high S. You called it steadiness. I'd also attach to that leading by example, right? I mean, I know that's an important part of your style, and that really comes from that steadiness. Like every day, like Tim's, putting in the full day, right? He's not going to ask his team to do something that he won't do. So talk a little bit more about your leading by example.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, the way I've always operated. I mean, from being a college captain on my football team, I led by example. That's how I got raised to being a captain, because people saw that my time I spent in the weight room, those kinds of things. But just being consistent, being steady, showing up every day. I think a lot of that came from my dad's work ethic. You look at the farm, it's kind of plodding. I mean, he's working 16, 18 hours a day, got a lot to get done, but you just keep at it and eventually you get it all accomplished. But you have to be consistent and, show up every day with that same level of work. So,
yeah. And as I look at my style, having the 7 compared to your 90 on the S, like listening is one of my challenges. It's one of my blind spots in my style. And so one of the takeaways today too from the podcast is really what techniques can we put in place to really overcome the blind spots of our style. So listening is a challenge for me. So I have a technique I call listening with my eyes. So when I'm talking to a person one-on-one, I keep my eyes on theirs because it focuses me on listening to them. So that's an example of a technique that I use to overcome the blind spots of my style. At a 7, I'm moving at a really fast pace, difficult to sit still. So you'll notice Tim sits really still. I'm constantly moving. That's a takeaway right there. So when I come into a room, I really have to be conscious of my pace. I have to, a lot of times before I enter a room, I'll have to take a deep breath and just slow myself down because I want to move at this lightning pace, but everyone's not wired that way. And if we remember, the disc, all of us are developed in our early years. And so this style is locked in, 11, 12, 13 years old, and it doesn't change in your lifetime. So again, one of the things that I really was excited about this podcast today because this is something that all leaders have to deal with. So we talked about some of the strengths of your style, Tim. Let's talk about some of the blind spots of your style and the things that you've had to overcome in your journey. And I think this is a huge takeaway for a lot of listeners as to what the blind spots of your style are and how did you overcome them and what did that look like for you?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, I've got maybe a little more consistent pace, but maybe not as aggressive style as you have, and at times that can frustrate people. Especially on my executive team, we tend to be a very collaborative environment. I like to get feedback from all of our leaders before we make a decision. Sometimes they'd prefer that that decision was made on the spot, and maybe that I make it. And there's certain situations where then I need to step up, which probably isn't natural for me, but I realize that there's some indecisiveness and I need to be the tiebreaker as the CEO and make that decision. So that can be a little challenging at times. And I think at times people have even said that maybe our pace of change or making decisions can be a little slow because of that. I tend to err again on that collaborative side, which I think is important, getting feedback from lots of people. So it's a well thought out decision. Another thing you and I have talked about through some of the leadership development you've worked with me on is that, there have been times when I've been challenged to have the difficult decision or the difficult discussion with somebody. We've had to make some changes in our organization and even at the executive level, and that probably because I care about people doesn't come easy for me. All right. I feel for them as a person and don't want to kick them to the curb or, have to make a change, but sometimes it's the right thing to do for the organization. And that doesn't come easy for me, but I've learned to deal with it and learned that I need to make those difficult decisions, have those difficult conversations at times and move on.
How do you get to the point where you recognize where it's time? Is there any type of process you go through or someone you rely on, or how do you get to the point where like, I gotta have this conversation?
Well, again, being that we're a very collaborative organization, there are a few more senior executives on our team that I tend to, take some guidance from, bounce some things off of, and after discussion with, I guess if you want to call it, sort of my mentors, the people that have been there, done that a little bit longer than I've done it. That's generally when I arrive at that decision point. Maybe it's a little later than others would. Maybe your style would move a little more quickly, or others that are leaders. But
not saying that's good.
Yeah, well, it works for us. So
yeah,
right.
Yeah. So, and you used a key word here that I think everybody really needs to take away is what's comfortable for our style and what's uncomfortable for our style. Right. Me having the tough conversations very comfortable for me. There's not going to be any hesitancy. There may be times where I maybe do it too soon or don't handle it right, but my style is comfortable with that. Where Tim's style, it's a little bit more uncomfortable for him, and he feels that, and then he takes action and overcomes that. And that's really the key takeaway, is that within our behavioral styles, which leads to our leadership identity, there's going to be things that come very comfortable. Like you sitting and Tim's a great listener, right? He's a really good listener. I'm not that good a listener, so I really have to overcome that and focus on that. And so it's really understanding the strengths and leveraging those things, but then recognizing our blind spots and being able to own that. Now, did you have a point in your career, Tim, where like you had to kind of come to do you have a moment that you remember where you kind of like, I get this, I understand it now, where you had more clarity around it, or was it just kind of an evolution for you?
I think it's kind of been an evolution, but I think some of that comes with experience and age as well. And, as I've been a natural leader of this organization since day one, because being one of the founders, I realized that I needed to step up. When we started the bank, I was 32. So I was still kind of in my infancy, if you want to say. My other three partners were quite a bit older than I was. And I've had to just learn these things along the way. But I'd say in the last 10 years, it's been more clear to me as to what I need to work on and how I need to focus on those blind spots and make sure I overcome them.
Yeah. One of the things that your style really brings out of your team is loyalty. I mean, I've spent time with you and your team, and like they'll run through a wall for you, and that to me is like, that is such a great reward, right? That your team is committed to the team, and you've built a high performance team there. And so I think some of the strengths of your style have really done that, right? And at the same time, you've had the conversations with your team on the things that come harder for you. So you've been open with your team on that. And I think that's a really important takeaway. from a standpoint of everybody in that room of your team has strengths and weaknesses, and being able to have that conversation around that has been important for your team. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's definitely built some cohesiveness with us. And because of some of your help, we've arrived at the spot where we're at. And this whole COVID thing has built us even stronger, which is interesting. And I think you've even alluded to the fact you've heard this from other companies as well, that because of the distance, even though you're not together, it seems to have built some cohesiveness, some togetherness that's been created, and even more unifying, which is interesting.
Yeah. And it's bringing teams together around a common purpose, something that we can overcome together. Because, I mean, just think about it, Tim. I mean, you and I have talked about this. The greatest challenge of this time is uncertainty. Business leaders can make decisions when they have certainty. When they have uncertainty, which we all have, so that's where a team really brings a ton of value. Talk a little bit about how your leadership style has shaped the culture at Investors Community Bank. How has your approach to leadership built the organization that it is today?
Well, we definitely have I guess our model that we live by for our dealing with our clients is we walk in our customers' shoes. So it's kind of showing that empathy that you mentioned earlier, which is a big part of my being, I guess, and how I treat people. And we've kind of passed that on to the entire team, and that we live by that as we deal with our clients and take care of our customers. And I think that's built a really strong relationship that we have with our clients. I think they know we really care. It's not just about the transaction and about making the money that we do from the transaction, that relationship we have with the client. And I think that goes a long way. And we've tended to try to sort for that as we've hired people too, especially on the frontline folks that are dealing with clients. And I think people appreciate that. And I think that really is a big attribute to our success that we've had for the last 23 years.
So as a CEO, you're developing leaders throughout your organization. How do you use what you've learned to develop other leaders in and outside of your organization? I'm sure you're involved in a bunch of other stuff, but how do you, based on what you've learned, what are the key takeaways that you like to share with other leaders that are in development?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, being genuine, just be yourself. Don't try to be something you're not. People can see through that and most often, and that's going to come across as phony. I think caring about people, I think that servant leadership model really works for us. And I think there are other companies throughout northeastern Wisconsin that I've studied that have done this. Festival is a great example. Mark Scogan, I know Mark well, and he does a great job with the servant leadership model. We haven't taken it to the extent that they have, but I think if you really show that you care about your people, they're going to take that and show that same kind of care for your clients, and it all kind of filters down and leads to success, right? And I think that's a key factor in any organization.
So when you get to a situation where caring and doing what's best for the business intersect, that's got to be what would be the word? Maybe an unsettling time or a difficult time for you. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah. Rephrase your question. You're saying when the business and the customer.
No, when you care for people, but you have to make a tough decision regarding people, what you feel is best for the organization. I'm assuming that's when our blind spots intersect with what we got to do right for the business, right? And that's when we have our toughest times, right?
Right, and I alluded to that earlier. That's not an easy direction for me or position, but I've learned to deal with it through the years, and it just takes some fortitude to make sure you deal with it. And ultimately that it's the right thing to do for the organization, right?
Yeah. Were there ever any misperceptions of your leadership style or leadership styles in general that you've experienced along the way that you took away that were learnings from? Did people ever have a misperception of your style and how you led, and how did that play out? Anything come to mind there?
Well, I think, it can be, perceived as maybe being a little bit weak, and maybe that isn't going to lead to success. but I think it has definitely benefited us. And I think that style and that mantra that we live by that I talked about before, that empathy, I think people really gravitate to that. Now, not everybody's going to gravitate to that, but I think generally we've had very good success with our team in leading with that style.
What has been the greatest challenge of leading with your natural style? And we may have touched on it already, but I want to make sure we cover some key points here so that there's some takeaway for our listeners. That what has been the greatest challenge of leading with your natural behavioral style?
Well, I think you alluded to it before. It's when those difficult decisions have to occur, and sometimes that can stress people, can stress me for sure. I end up with a number of sleepless nights if those kind of things occur, and I'm thinking about it and stewing on it and trying to formulate a direction and an approach to dealing with it. But that's probably the biggest thing, biggest takeaway, I'd say, Steve.
Yeah. And I would just say the greatest challenge that I've had is really taking time with my pace, taking time to understand where my team members are at, making sure I take time to understand, because my mindset is solving problems. That one of the strengths of my style is I solve problems. I'm a problem solver. However, sometimes I don't take the time to really understand where the company, the team member, or the person is at, and I've really worked hard at that. And really, for me, that comes down to just asking a lot of questions. Questions force me to take more time with people to understand who they are, where they're at, before I start jumping into helping them solve their challenge or whatever they're facing, be it personally or professionally. And so that was a takeaway for me, one of the greatest challenges that I still face in it. One question that a lot of people learn from as we talk to successful leaders is, what was the greatest mistake you ever made as a leader, Tim? Can you think of one that comes to mind?
I can't think of a specific instance, but I thought about this a little bit this morning as we prep for this, and I'd say maybe one of my weaknesses is at times I tend to be too trusting. All right, I believe the best in people, and occasionally you get burned in that. I think generally people are pretty genuine and pretty honest. Here in Northeast Wisconsin for sure, in Wisconsin in general, but in Midwest. But I think that's probably maybe one of the lessons I've learned, to make sure you kind of buffer that a little bit and make sure you really get at the essence of a person before you maybe engage them or do business with them, right? And I think some of the things that you've worked and helped us with, the assessment tools and things like that, really get at the essence of what makes people tick. That's been helpful.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this. It's really about understanding who you are and then owning who you are. And a lot of people really struggle with that second step. I can tell you I struggled with it for several years. I'm really owning the blind spots of my style, the things that I'm not necessarily a big fan about myself, right? And other people feel, but I got to own that, right? Because it's who I am. And then once you understand and own it, now you can leverage it to be the best leader that you can be. And that's one of the coolest parts about knowing Tim Schneider for me, is that you have owned who you are, come from working on a dairy farm to what you've accomplished, and you've been yourself the whole time. You've led based on who you are. And that's a big time accomplishment. So I just want to point that out.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So for our listeners that are out there listening that are trying to figure out how to lead most effectively with who they are, do you have any parting thoughts or advice to them on how to lead based on who you are naturally?
Well, I think it's probably challenging as a young person to sort through all that. You're new to the business world. You've had access to maybe different bosses that you've taken a few things away from, but after time, I think you kind of crystallize some of that internally as exactly what it is that makes you tick and makes you successful. I kind of found that I think it started down the path when I was, growing up. And like I said, when I played college football, I like to use the football analogy a lot. in football, unlike just about any other sport, I think you have to have all 11 people clicking. One person makes a mistake. You know this, Steve. You played college football too. I mean, if one person makes a mistake, if that lineman misses his block on the line, the whole play is busted, right? And that unison and coordination that has to occur for that team to be successful, I think, is critical. And I try to display that with our team here. I try to, lead by example. Make sure that we're doing our assignments. We're handling what we're expected to do. I think that's a great comparison of a success, story that I can talk a little bit about.
And that I'll build on that metaphor, that analogy, that the offensive lineman is as important as the quarterback.
Absolutely.
Because
that's why I was a tight end in college and was a glorified tackle because we ran the wishbone. So I got the ball thrown at me 4 times in my entire career.
How many times did you catch it?
Twice. 2 other times they were just dummy passes. Just threw it over my head so you keep the defense honest.
So you were 50%.
But it comes back to really that coordination and making sure you're disciplined. And my college football coach was a stern disciplinarian when it came to making sure you had the plays down, and understood exactly what everybody needed to do on every play. That's why we practiced 3 or 4 hours a day, it felt like, in River Falls back in the day, and cold nights. And yeah, it was great lessons learned, though, no doubt.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing your story and your journey along the way. I can't impress upon our listeners how important it is to understand your style, and that every style has to lead in certain situations, and every style is going to lead differently. So be the leader you are, and lead with your strengths. Understand where things that may be uncomfortable for you, and then put techniques in place. Put people around you that help you work through and overcome those blind spots of your style. That is the key message today, and Tim is an incredible example of that. And that's why I was really excited about having him on our podcast, because he has, in a leadership role, a lot of times you have to make very hard decisions, tough decisions. You have to have tough conversations, and it doesn't always come naturally to him, but he recognized it, he's been able to overcome it. And the success, going from being on a dairy farm to taking a bank public, I mean, that validates that he understands, owns, and leverages style, and that is the takeaway from today. So let's do a little speed round, Tim, a little fun here for you so the listeners can get to know Tim Schneider a little bit. So what leader did you learn the most from?
Well, I'd say it's a combination. I talked a little bit about my parents. Obviously, the upbringing I had early in my life were important. Some of the coaches I had along the way, both my high school football coach and my college football coach, were big influences in my life. Bill Sensky, the chairman of our board, former CEO, co-founder of the bank. I learned a lot from Bill. I also had a former boss at the Farm Credit System right out of college that I really adored. And he was a great leader, rolled up his sleeves with me, taught me things early on about credit that I didn't understand, was really willing to take the time and mentor me. So I think all those folks had major influences on my leadership style through the years.
So we just did a podcast on your Mount Rushmore of influence. So those would be the people on your Mount Rushmore, right?
Absolutely.
Name one thing that is on the top of your bucket list.
Probably to travel to Germany, which is where my heritage is. I'd love to go see the homeland and see what it's like there, and just travel around with my wife. It'd be a great trip. She may not want to go to Germany. She's of a Scottish descent, so that's her choice. But we'll have to arm wrestle for that, or flip a coin.
You can do both. One thing I suggest is Oktoberfest in Munich. I've been there, done that. It was one of the top 5 best times of my life. Number one quality you want to be remembered for?
I want to be remembered for being a good person, giving back, being honest. All of those are important to me. Being real.
One of your greatest passions outside work?
I enjoy giving back. I've volunteered a lot through the years for a number of different organizations, and I talk about it a lot. Giving of our time, talent, and treasure. And I like doing that with nonprofits and various boards that I have served on through the years.
Best business book you ever read?
Everybody Matters by Bob Chapman is a book that we all have read as an executive team. And we've been going through chapters, and we've also been up to some sessions that St. Norbert has held with the Chapman Institute. Um, and it really gets back to that servant leadership model and taking care of people, and really ties in perfectly to how our organization's been built.
Yeah, it's wheelhouse. That's wheelhouse for you. Last and most important question, what's your favorite ice cream flavor?
Well, I didn't want to say vanilla because I know you'd slap me for that one, Steve, but
It is not
really
vanilla, is it really?
no, it's
All right.
Caramel Collision from Cedar Crest. So
Caramel Collision. Holy
really
cow.
good.
All right. Well, thanks for being with us today, Tim. And I just really, again, want to reinforce understanding, owning, and leveraging your style to be the best leader that you can be based on who you are, and as Tim put it, who you are most genuine to be, right? Be that leader, but understand the strengths, understand the blind spots, and build people and systems around you to overcome those things to be a great leader. Tim, where can we learn more about Investors Community Bank, about your organization?
Yeah, website's probably the best, www.investorscommunitybank.com, and should have all the information out there. We've been doing a lot more social media blasts and things like that, so you can find us on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter. And also, you may have seen some of our TV ads that we've been running in the Green Bay market as well. So trying to get the word out a little bit, but the website's the best place to go.
All right. Well, Tim, thanks a lot for being with us today and sharing your leadership journey. I have a great deal of respect for you, your team, and what you guys have accomplished there, because there's no one way to do it, and you found the way that fits who you guys are best, and that's like the key takeaway from today is be who you can be the leader you can be, but be yourself. So if you got value from our podcast today, please share it with others, and leave us a review. We'd appreciate that. And just remember that here at Stop the Vanilla, we want to be a resource to help you achieve your business, your career, and your life goals by having the right strategy and the right talent. Thank you for listening to the Stop the Vanilla podcast. If today's episode would bring value to someone you know, make sure to pass it on to them. If this podcast has brought you value, make sure you leave a review, helping others find it as well. If you want to receive our content, head over to stopthevanilla.com and sign up for The Scoop, a weekly email of quick tips on strategy, talent, and leadership. Or download a ton of free resources and templates. Thanks again for tuning in to the Stop the Vanilla podcast, where we help you achieve what you want in your business, your career, and your life by having the right plan, implemented with the right talent.
Let me cool you one time, you be my